Welcome to Sapien Analysis.
Okay, let's get into your blog. And you told me before we actually got to talk a little where you started the blog and you started writing partly with your experience with the kids and the women you met. So could you actually tell me that how you started it and what kind of compelled you
to do it?
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting, I think, in a way, because as a clinician, I had immense respect for all the people who were in academics and research. And I had a kind of inferiority complex that as a clinician, did I have anything of value to say? And then over time, I began to realize that I understood these kids and these adults in a way that the people who were doing research didn't. You might do a factor analysis on them, but I knew what it was like to be them. And so I knew what the family issues were. And so I wanted to help people understand what the experience of kids is like. And so early on, I was writing more about kids with, who are either nonverbal learning disability or autistic, and kind of what their experience was, what they were running into. And this is a digression, but you might be interested in using it. When I was in school, I was a very bright student, but I didn't know it, but I had a learning disability, and my learning disability is dysgraphia and in writing. And so I, to this day, cannot handwrite a note and not leave words out. So for me, the word processor was a lifesaver. But back in the day when I was taking school, there weren't laptops and there weren't word processors, and I had to write everything out by hand. And I was always leaving out words or not forming them correctly. And teachers told me I was the worst writer they'd ever seen. Okay. And that's how I saw myself. And that's kind of how I ended up in science. Because in science, they weren't asking me to do as much writing, and I understood what I was doing. And I did a project that ended me up in an international science fair, and everyone said, "Oh, look, you're really good in science." So, there I went into science. And afterwards, I went into psychology. But when I first started in psychology, my writing was more academic, neuropsychological test reports, things like that. And I got asked to do a column for a web magazine that was ahead of its time as the working mom shrink. And the editor taught me how to write in a voice that was sort of more fun and more sassy. And I learned that I actually was a very good writer, and that the mechanics of writing had always kept me from writing.
Right.
So I decided as I was learning this that I really liked writing, because it gave me a way to express some of what I knew and I understood that I wanted to communicate to other people. And I would have a platform like Psychology Today or somewhere like that. And I could say, what I observed or what I thought, and people, and share it with people. And that as a clinician, I did have something to say in my understanding of. So that's how I got into writing.
Okay.
And I was interested in, so as I said, I was writing a lot about for nonverbal learning disabilities and then autism. And I was contacted by somebody who was the head of an incredible website that's by and for people on the spectrum called Neuroclastic, who said, "You kind of get it. And so, come, be part of this group that's all autistic." And, and I met people, and everything I had learned was wrong. these were people who very much wanted to be connected to other people, who were very funny, who had very dry and witty senses of humor, who could be very supportive, who, showed each other a lot of encouragement. And, I mean, it's this world that nobody saw because people were struggling through that social gap. And, and responding to people in terms of, well, you're not doing it the way I would do it. So I'll give you one example. Let's say that you tell me you're really upset because your cat died.
Mm-hmm.
And you would expect me to come over and maybe I'd put my arm around you if I knew you well enough. Or I'd say, just, I'm so sorry, losing an animal is terrible. And someone on the spectrum might say, oh, my cat died too. And what they're trying to say is, I understand.
Right.
Not saying it in the way you expect. And so you might say, well, that person's very self-focused. She's thinking about herself and not about me.
Right.
But in fact, what she's communicating is, I understand, I've been through this too.
Right.
And people may not show emotion in the same way. So I was dealing with a young man who had been arrested for having caused an accident. And it was completely accidental, by the way. He, was wet and he skidded. But he was being accused of having done it on purpose.
Wow.
And he said that, it completely was an accident, and that he cared very deeply about the people who were hurt, and he was going to, do everything he could to help provide money to that family as he got a job. And he's only 20, as he got a job, and he would do anything he could to help that family. And the prosecutor said that he obviously showed no remorse because he never cried. So again, this person is struggling to have themselves be understood, but the behavior that's being looked for isn't what they're exhibiting. And so there's this social gap of understanding and being, understood.
Yeah.
So I was writing about that. And once I was really seeing people close up, I was writing more about it. And I ended up writing a blog about autistic children in school. My blogs gave me lots of opportunities to speak and, requests to speak for groups and things like that. But one of the things that I was really interested in and concerned about is that because there's this tendency to just look at behavior and not look at experience, that autistic kids in school were constantly being treated as if their behavior was only because they were autistic. It was basically non-functional. And so conforming to typical behavior is what is expected and was the gold standard of working well with them. When in fact, a child might be doing a non-conforming behavior because they're sensorily overwhelmed, or because the social demand, people don't realize school is nonstop social demand.
Yeah.
You sit in the classroom and people may be working, but somebody might look at you and roll their eyes.
Yeah.
And, there's all this social demand, or demand to transition from one class to another, or there's just all these demands that these kids are trying to deal with. But when they don't do them smoothly, when the kid stands there and, crying or screaming because they're and no one says, oh, maybe this is social sensory overwhelm.
Yeah.
Nobody ever thinks of that. They just think of she's attention seeking, or she's avoiding being in class, or something like that. So these kids are constantly getting feedback that what you're doing is bad, or that what we need to do is extinguish what you're doing. I had one girl in Spanish class, and this was in high school, and she would draw on her iPad. Well, you shouldn't draw on your iPad in Spanish. So there was a plan that she would get one warning, and if she didn't put away her iPad, it would get taken away from her the second time. And so they did that, and it got taken away from her, and she put her head on the desk and she was crying. And the teacher said, well, your head's on the desk. If you're so tired, you can go to the nurse, which embarrass the girl in front of the entire class. And what no one bothered with is that it was a very rowdy class with lots of boys who made lots of noise. She couldn't stand the sensory experience, and the only way she could calm herself was to draw. But nobody understood that. So these kids go through this over and over and over again. And so I wrote a blog on how, and I was on the clinical advisory group of a organization called AANE.org, which is the Association for Autism and Neurodiversity, and was talking to some of the people on that board and said, I think these kids all come out with trauma. And the guy was the head of it, said, yes, I think all these kids come out traumatized. So I wrote a blog on, do autistic kids get PTSD in school? And much to my surprise, 257,000 people read it.
Yeah.
And I was getting all kinds of emails from people saying, this is my life. This is my story. This is my children's story. I can't get the school to understand it. I try to, and please, do something and write a book so I can bring it into school. And that's how I ended up writing a book for my blog, and from sharing something that turned out to be the experience of so many people.
This video is brought to you by Allura Online. If you love our fantastic videos, guess what? Allura Online can create amazing content for you too. Want to elevate your brand with top-notch videos? Check out the Fiverr link in the description or send a private email for more details. Act now and snag some exclusive discounts. Don't miss out. Contact Allura Online today and take your content to the next level.